Welcome back, guys, and today I have something a little bit different on the video front for you in the form of a Q&A. This was kind of spontaneous, so if you don't follow me on Twitter, you probably didn't know that it was coming, but if you guys do like this sort of thing, I can definitely do it again in the future, and if I do that, I'll make sure to make those that follow me just on here and not on Twitter more aware of that, so that you'll have a better chance at asking me questions in the future. The gameplay you're seeing in the background is me playing on my all Madden sliders, which should be going up soon in my franchise startup video, but this is a Q&A and you guys had questions and I have answers, so let's get right into it, starting with what was your thought process on choosing the Falcons and what were the other teams you had in mind? The thought process was mainly that I wanted a team who had never won a Super Bowl, which greatly limited my options from the get-go, but then I also wanted a team that wasn't absolutely terrible and that had a chance at the playoffs, but also wasn't one of the better teams in the league. Because my franchise is a bit more of a slow burn where I go game to game and try to have things be realistic, taking a team like the Dolphins would result in a lot of losing early on and in my mind make things less interesting than if I'm fighting for a playoff spot throughout the season while also trying to maintain a playoff caliber roster. So at 7-9 this past season and in a tough division, the Falcons were a team I kind of locked onto pretty early on, but when the Madden 20 team ratings came out and I saw that they were actually the 6th best team in the game, I did start having some second thoughts and considered going with a team like the Jets since they haven't won a Super Bowl in a really long time. And then another team I started considering was the Titans because I started a franchise with them testing sliders and they have an interesting roster and a lot of interesting choices this upcoming season with Derrick Henry and Marcus Mariota being free agents, and they're in that same kind of position of being a fringe playoff team. But ultimately I decided to stick with the plan I had early on and go with the Falcons, and I'm hoping everything works out okay there. When did you become a game changer? You never said anything about it, and then boom, you are one. It's been about just over a year now, not quite a year and a half, but pretty much since May of last year. It's something that I've thought about telling people about a few times, but I never really wanted the attention for it. That kind of stuff gets overwhelming for me pretty quickly. And then another thing is that I think people too often use that as a title and for clout more than anything, when in reality it's supposed to be about making the game better. I couldn't care less about the title or the clout that comes along with that, and I'd rather have people acknowledge the work or the effort that I'm putting in to try and improve franchise mode or improve the game rather than it being about having the words EA Game Changer in my bio. Next question is, I personally feel the dev team should have a guy doing YouTube tutorials on gameplay mechanics, like properly IDing the mic, understanding cover 4, cover 3, cover 2, etc. I mean, those things can turn the light on for frustrated players. How about you? I definitely think that that would be useful and wouldn't be surprised to see something like that in the future, because I think that's a pain point that can create a lot of incorrect feedback where you'll see someone complaining about players acting a certain way, not realizing that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to. It's just not really indicated with the play art, which is what a ton of people go off of. They've tried to do things like the skills trainer and weekly training within franchise to aid with that, but I think those things do a better job of showing rather than teaching, if that makes sense. I know there have been other things like A-Dub or Anthony White had some coverage breakdowns last year, but it's one of those things that if you're not seeking it out, you're not really going to find it. But like I said, I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that in the future, because I think keeping players informed and educated is a big priority for them. Is it easy doing the Photoshop for all of the next year of Madden wish lists? That's a tough question. It's easy for me, I guess, or at least a lot easier now than it used to be, simply because I'm better at it and more experienced. If you're just picking up Photoshop, though, it's probably something that would be really difficult and overwhelming, but I'd say the toughest part is just coming up with the vision itself. Once you have the vision of what you want things to look like and all of that's in place, creating everything is pretty easy, but definitely time consuming, and that creator's block definitely sets in from time to time and makes creating those kinds of things a lot tougher and take a lot longer. But once the ball gets rolling, things end up usually going pretty smoothly. Why do you think it's so hard for them to get things right in the sim engine? Example, tight ends being dominant in sim engine and on field. When it comes to the sim engine, I think it's more of a case of priority than anything. For the most part, the sim engine is pretty good, but undeniably has some flaws, but none of them are really game breaking. Even the most notable issue of quarterbacks not running doesn't really affect anything. It just looks bad from a polish and attention to detail standpoint. The other thing with the sim engine is that I'd have to imagine it's quite reactive. So while simply making quarterbacks run might be pretty easy, it can just as easily throw off a bunch of other numbers in the system. And when you consider that things are, like I said, for the most part pretty good, it's just something that is low on the priority list, so it doesn't really get looked at or touched. Also, why do you think they program DBs to overrun routes by 4 yards and safeties to cover nothing? It has to be by design, right? Surely they see it themselves. I don't necessarily think it's by design, at least when it comes to DBs overrunning routes and breaking the wrong way. I think certain things like that are just natural issues that you see year in and year out, and if I had to guess, I think something like that may be a complication of some of the changes to RPM. As for the safeties, I think that's more of a legacy thing where the AI just isn't up to snuff and smart enough to react and contextually consider things realistically. I think defense is one of those things that from a development standpoint is also viewed as it being better to be too bad than it is to be too good. If it's too good and the average user can't move the ball or score touchdowns, the game becomes less fun for them. Then on the flip side of that, I think if defense is too good or too smart, it also becomes an issue for the competitive crowd as well, where skill becomes less prevalent because the AI defenders are too good and essentially playing for the user. I know that's not what people want to hear, but all in all, I think it's something that they definitely see and are aware of, and hopefully there will be a fix soon, but those are my thoughts on why things might be the way they are. Do you think Fog of War will eventually affect more than just dev traits like overall grades and individual grades? I definitely think it could, and I certainly hope it does. It's something that I'm going to continue to personally push for, and I think it's something that the franchise devs will consider. I think part of it kind of banks on how well received the Fog of War elements from Madden 20 are, and while that is having some issues early on, all I've really seen is the desire for more of it and frustration around the fact that there isn't more of it and that it doesn't take into account all dev traits. I think the main worry for the devs is users not being aware of having something good and losing that instant gratification factor when it comes to drafting players, which I do understand, but at the same time, I will always feel like more Fog of War has a place in franchise mode and can also add a lot to it as well. I personally thought QB1 was shallow and very linear. Would love to see more customization and branching story elements. What are your thoughts on QB1 this year, and what would you like to see implemented to the mode in future iterations? To be brutally honest, I think it's pretty terrible. It's being touted as a new mode, but personally, I have a really hard time considering it that because it plays out more like a prologue than any kind of new mode. And once you do the initial stuff, it just throws you into player mode that now has the scenario engine, but ultimately still hasn't been touched in years. And so while it's connected to franchise mode in that way, I don't really think it adds much to the mode or really does anything to benefit franchise at all. But playing the college games is really cool, and I like that aspect of it, so I'd like to see more of that, but it's just like you mentioned, so shallow and linear that it makes your performance and decisions feel pointless. That being said, I definitely think some kind of superstar mode definitely has its place, but I think they really need to reevaluate what they want it to be, and it has to be its own thing. It can't just be latched onto franchise mode. I also thought Long Shot was really bad, and QB1 feels more like a condensed extension of that. I'm not really sure what I'd want to see implemented in the future other than it just being, like you said, not so linear. You're designing franchise for Madden 21, but the producers only give you enough resources to add 2 new features, one major, a larger system with a big impact, something marketable, and one minor, a smaller adjustment to an existing system. What do you do? For the bigger feature, it has to be coaching staffs. It's got to be coaching staffs, I'd say. It was between that and new scouting, but coaching staffs is a bit more marketable, I think, and I think getting that in place first would allow you to integrate it into the current scouting system and then take on a new scouting system the next year. I always say it when I talk about coaching staffs, but there's just so many different parts of franchise that it can touch and affect that are already there that you don't even really need to add. For position coaches, you could tie them into player development and scouting, and then for coordinators and head coaches, the focus with them would be mainly around schemes and play style. It's also something that I always see on people's wish list for franchise features, so I think that would definitely have to be the major feature. As for the minor feature, I want to say a UI overhaul that pushes the newsfeed to the front and is something more reminiscent of the older Maddens or NCAA games, something simple, quick, and easier to navigate than what we currently have, but I think that could also be something that is considered a major major feature, and I don't know all that would go into making that possible. So an alternative to that would be expanding upon Fog of War. I'd want to expand it to all dev traits and intangible player ratings, and that includes overall, and make the process of discovering the ability of drafted players a more interesting experience. Follow-up question, same scenario, but you have no restrictions except you are still limited this time to 3 things, whether that be removing something, adding something, or tweaking something to set a foundation for future years. What do you do? I'm still going to go with coaching staffs, and then with no restrictions, I'd probably throw overhauling scouting in there as well. Those would add an interesting and important piece to the offseason, while scouting would make things a bit more interesting during the season. Scouting wouldn't really do much for the future, but I think coaching staffs is one of those things that whatever you decide to add in the following years, you can almost certainly find a way to connect it to the coaches, which I think would help things become a bit more cohesive and a big foundational piece moving forward. For the third thing, I'd probably want to start doing everything I could to tie in parts of franchise mode with the scenario engine. I might be cheating here a little bit, as it would technically be 2 things, but I would completely get rid of big decisions and shift things like negotiations and player trades to scenarios. I think a lot of the issues that come with things like that are because of the freedom and amount of user variables, and I think moving things like that to the scenario engine, where you can still make them interesting but also have them in a more controlled environment with less variables, could potentially improve and make things more interesting. Next question is, you've been getting a lot of attention from EA, and some of the team have even seen your franchise ideas. Do they often ask you about it, or have you help with particular things? Not really. I mean, there's feedback events where that kind of thing takes place, but outside of that, I'll get a question here or there. But for the most part, everything like that takes place at the feedback events. We have a game changer chat as well, where conversations like that can take place. But I can definitely say that they're aware of how I feel and any ideas that I bring to the table. And it's not like if I had something to say or feedback that I couldn't easily reach out to them. Coke or Pepsi? Coke all the way, and no, Pepsi is not okay. And then to our last question, why is EA so far behind 2K in franchise/league modes? I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I'd say the main things are the foundation and the priorities. I still think that while it may have been better for the online side of things, the move to the CCM/CFM foundation really set things back and continues to hold back franchise mode. 2K, meanwhile, seems to have a much more solid foundation when it comes to adding things and just overall having a more cohesive mode. And then the other thing is priorities. Madden seems to prioritize the casual and new user and the type of player that is the majority of who plays their game the most, and that severely limits what is possible and what can be done. Meanwhile, 2K seems to take the approach of prioritizing the players that play the mode the most, which allows them to add a lot more challenging and deep features because they're building around the players that actually play the mode rather than the ones that might not even touch it. But that's going to do it, guys. Let me know if you enjoy this kind of thing, and I can definitely do it more in the future. Upcoming videos will include the startup of the Falcons franchise with the sliders and settings I'll be using, and then another video covering preseason highlights with a look at our final 53-man roster and schedule for the upcoming season. As always, I appreciate you guys tuning in, and until next time, thanks for watching.